What's up, vinyl community? Welcome back to Dad's on a Budget Vinyl. My name is Mark. I appreciate you coming back and hanging out today. And today in the producer's chair, we've got Joe Boyd. Um, before we dive in, so you start collecting records, you bring them home, put the record on the turntable, you get the album out, you start going through it, looking through the liner notes. I love liner notes, reading the back cover, seeing, who the guest artists are, or, the songwriting credits, or, and you start to notice different things. Maybe it's the record label itself, maybe it's the recording studio where it was recorded, um, you know, maybe it was the producer, and I didn't pay attention to that for a long time. I knew in kind of George Martin produced the Beatles, and I know about Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, and my cat is going crazy down here. We have a new kitten, and he is just running around wild, so he might make an appearance, but. The producer, and that can be kind of a flip-floppy thing. I mean, people talk about wonderful production or a great record with horrible production. So a couple of examples would be like Todd Rundgren's production of Skylarking, or Phil Spector's production of All Things Must Pass. You love it or you hate it, right? But producers, and then somehow, like around, 40 years ago now, I remember the first producer that and it was associated with the Beastie Boys, and it was Rick Rubin. And, the next thing we've got, Johnny Cash and Tom Petty and the Dixie Chicks and Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Rick Rubin, is kind of a household name. And then, later on in the 80s, Daniel Lanois came out with a great solo record, and then produced, the Joshua Tree for U2. And the next thing you've got Emmylou Harris's Wrecking Ball, and you can't talk about Dylan, and Oh Mercy and Time Out of Mind, produced by Daniel Lanois, Teatro, Willie Nelson, all of those wonderful records. And then, kind of the biggie, the big modern day producer's name, T-Bone Burnett, who, really in the 70s played guitar in Dylan's touring band, and came out with a few solo records, had a little bit of moderate success with the Alpha Band, married Sam Phillips, produced some great records for her, produced Los Lobos. But wow, when Oh Brother, Where Art Thou came out, the next thing you know, T-Bone Burnett is a household name. I mean, on the hype stickers of records that he would produce, his name would be as big as the artist's name. So producers became a big deal, but long before any of those cats, there was Joe Boyd. And today I want to shine a light on a baker's dozen of his records that he produced, and tell a little bit of his story. There's a wonderful book, Joe Boyd, White Bicycles. I picked this up. I knew of Joe Boyd in a peripheral way. I really kind of picked the book up because I knew that White Bicycles was a song by a band called Tomorrow. Steve Howe, I'm a huge Yes fan, and Steve Howe is one of my favorite guitarists. He was in the band Tomorrow in the song White Bicycles, and so I was intrigued and picked it up. It's an absolutely great book. Joe Boyd was born in 1942 in Boston, went to Princeton, graduated from Harvard in 64. Came from a somewhat musical family. His mother played piano, and I believe his aunt did, and his grandmother as well. He would sit under the piano and absorb those sounds and chords and sound waves and that type of thing, and fell in love with the sound of music early on. And I believe one of them, maybe his grandmother, gave him the vinyl Encyclopedia of Jazz, which had like Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Thelonious Monk and people like that. And, at a time when the rest of the world was falling in love with pop, Joe Boyd was listening to old jazz 78s and seeking out old blues and stuff like that. And so even when he was in college, uh, fell in with a couple of guys that were fellow jazz and blues aficionados. So this is Joe Boyd. This is Tom Rush. This is Jeff Moldar. This is, at the time, Maria Diamato. Not too far away would become Maria Moldar. But this was at the Newport Festival '65. Jeff and Joe Boyd were roommates earlier on, and they fell in love with that music and would sit around listening to those records. And one of the great stories, and I'll tell it real quick, they loved an old blues guitarist named Monty Johnson, who had his peak in the late 20s and 30s. They found out that he was retired and just living about 90 miles down the road, so they got out the yellow pages or the phone book. You could do that at the time. And looked him up and called him and said, hey, if we come down and, bring you back up here to the dorm and, pay you $100, would you be willing to play? And, I love the idea of just doing that. We could do that. We could try to do that. Let's go get this musician and bring him here and put on a concert. And that was kind of the mindset, that managerial production kind of mindset that Joe Boyd developed early on. And the concert was a great success. They ended up doing a couple of other times with different artists, not to such great results, but he's up and running. And another thing happened at about the same time. Joe was out in the outfield catching pop flies because he hadn't made the A-cut baseball team. And some kid, a couple of dorms over, throws open his windows and puts on Fats Domino walking into New Orleans. And Joe has kind of an epiphany of sorts that music that we listen to, the pop, the jazz, the blues, Fats Domino, it's all the same. That's good music. And number two, I could record that. I could make records. I could make records for people to listen to and enjoy. And the next thing you know, he's hooked up with George Wein, and he's doing managing musical tours of old blues artists in Europe. Muddy Waters and Sister Rosetta and Reverend Gary Davis and Brownie Terry and Sonny Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry and all these cats, and taking them on these tours and learning how that works and learning how to pair this artist with that artist and how to get the best sound and that type of thing. And he's up and running. So I've got some notes here because I don't want to get this wrong. There's a whole lot of material, and the cat's still going crazy down there. I love it. Joe Boyd, it was just he was involved in so many different cool and wonderful things that happened in music in the mid to late 60s and beyond. In '65, he was at Newport when Dylan went electric. In '66, late '65, he heads over to London. He's hooked up with Paul Rothchild of Elektra Records, and he's over in London kind of scouting acts for Elektra, that type of thing. He ends up recording the Incredible String Band in 1966, goes to see them in a small club. At that time, it's just Robin Williamson and Clive Bunker, and he thinks these guys are going to be his first superstars. And by the time he can come back and find them a couple of months later, the club that they had been playing in, the Incredible String Club, had closed down. That's why they were called the Incredible String Band. And he ended up able to find them, and by then they had added Mike Herron and become a three-piece. He gets them in the studio and records their first record. And basically it was a pretty informal affair, just them sitting around in a circle with a microphone and that type of thing. And it's a good record. But after it came out, or after they released it, Clive left to go do something else, and it left Robin and Mike. And Joe was really falling in love with the studio and the opportunities, the different things that you could do in the studio. And in 1966, oh, he also was influential in forming really what became Cream. In 1966, they wanted to put together like a blues supergroup, and it was Joe Boyd that suggested Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce and Eric Clapton get together. And of course, they did, recorded 4 sides, called What's Shakin', with a group loosely referred to as the Powerhouse. And barely missed, signing the newly formed Cream. Robert Stigwood comes in at the last minute and signs Cream. So that's the first time that Joe kind of missed the mark. And that happened several times in his career, but that's okay, because the body of work that we were left with is amazing. So in 66, you've got the first Incredible String Band record. You've got that Eric Clapton powerhouse group. In 1967, they come out with 5,000 Spirits, or Layers of an Onion. This is a wonderful, wonderful record. Psychedelic, trippy. The sounds of the instruments kind of leap out of the speakers. And, it's really easy to put this on now and say, well, it's not that big a deal. But when you realize that it came out in 1966, one of the first productions by Joe Boyd, and the music is absolutely fantastic. Some of them are a little trippy. This is kind of like a precursor, from Incredible String Band, 5,000 Layers, all the way up through like Devendra Banhart. That would be the line. But the Mad Hatter song, Little Cloud, Eyes of Fate, Blues for the Muse, the Hedgehog song. This is a wonderful, wonderful record. So that's 1966. In 67. In 68, he records the first Fairport record. So the story behind Joe Boyd and Fairport, he goes to see them. He's listening to them play and thinking they're good, but they're playing the stuff that he's kind of trying to get away from. American folk and that type of thing. But then Richard Thompson, the young 17-year-old Richard Thompson, rips into a solo, and Joe's like, okay, yeah, this is it. And so immediately after the show, goes back and signs them, and they come out with their first record, and it's fine. At about the same time, Joe is going to see Sandy Denny in a local coffee house, folk house, and single, solo guitar, singing old, folk songs and that type of thing. And he thought she had a great voice, but it was a little loud, a little bit brash. And of course, that was her in that small club without a PA, trying to let the people in the back hear. And so, of course, she was singing loud. But they formed a friendship, and they ended up back at Sandy's parents' house, Sandy Denny's parents' house. And by the way, that's them on the cover of Unhalf Bricking, in front of their house with the band in the background. But anyway, someone had given them a cassette tape of the unreleased new Beatles record, Sgt. Pepper's. And they've gone back to her parents' house to listen to it. Of course, they're blown away by it. And they're talking about how the band and the sounds and the recording have matured to the point where that coffee house folk singer thing is kind of being left behind. And, Joe's thinking, man, yeah, you really sound good with a good band behind you. And she says, well, I've got this tape of me in this band called the Straubs. And she puts it on for Joe, and he hears her voice for the first time, properly recorded, with a proper band behind her. And wow. And immediately the bells go off, the light bulb moment. She would sound great with Fairport. Well, Fairport already had a lead singer, Judy Dybel, and she was not only their singer, she was Richard Thompson's girlfriend. So things had to kind of shake out, but eventually Richard and Judy broke up. Sandy was invited to a rehearsal, And the next thing you know, Jed's a Millionaire and Sandy Denny is in Fairport Convention. So they come out with that second record in 1968. Incredible String Band also releases Hangman's Beautiful Daughter and We Tam. In 68, Paul McCartney said that Hangman's Beautiful Daughter was the best record of 68, and that was above his own band's White Album. So there you go. So in 69, first Fairport record, 68. In 69, Fairport releases What We Did on Our Holidays and Unhalf Bricking. What We Did is so much better than the first record, and Unhalf Bricking is so much better than the second record. And it, of course, includes the Sandy Denny written Who Knows Where the Time Goes. But it's just an absolutely wonderful record, and they've recorded it. It's only May of 69, and they've already released What We Did on Our Holidays and Unhalf Bricking. At about that time, Joe Boyd is turned on to Nick Drake. And, it's just incredible now. The Nick Drake is a beloved artist, but at the time, he was just a guy, and Joe Boyd listens to him. Nick drops off a tape. He listens to the tape. There's wonderful stories all over YouTube. There's talking head moments of, Joe Boyd talking about how he recorded all of these different artists. But anyway, I know I'm being long-winded, and I'm only 2 records in. In 69, 5 Leaves Left came out. Of the two records that Joe Boyd produced of Nick Drake, we only have 3. John Wood produced Pink Moon. Joe produced 5 Leaves and Brighter Later. This is my favorite of all of them. The musicianship on it is absolutely fantastic. And so this is where, Joe Boyd talks about the way he records a band live in the studio. That's the way that he likes to do it. The studio, and later on when they moved into Sound Techniques studio with John Wood as engineer, Sound Techniques had a multi-level ceiling. There was a portion of it that was 8 feet tall, there was a portion that was 12 feet tall, and there was a portion that was like 20 feet tall. So depending on where you placed the microphones or the musicians, you could get a different sound. But he recorded everybody together at the same time. People have asked if they could if it could be done to release Nick Drake just solo, him and the guitar, without the orchestra and without the other instruments. And it can't be done because it was all recorded together. And when that's the case, the different instruments bleed into each other's different microphones, and you get a different sound. I didn't really... The first light bulb moment that I had when it came to most of this is I was reading about the recording of When the Levee Breaks, Led Zeppelin 4, which was recorded mostly at Headley Grange Castle. And I've always loved the drum sound of When the Levee Breaks. John Bonham's guitar drum kit set up at the bottom of this huge stairwell, and it's mic'd there locally, but they also put microphones at the top, so the sound would come out and swell up and be recorded, and so you've got like a natural reverb there, and it really can make an absolute difference. But going back to this record and to Nick Drake, what a wonderful artist. Joe Boyd was obviously blown away at Nick's articulation, his creativity, his songwriting, his lyrics, his delivery, his playing, everything about it. And these songs, of course, some of our favorites, Riverman, The Day Is Done, Way Too Blue, the cello song, Thoughts of Mary Jane, Fruit Tree. But my absolute favorite is Man in the Shed. This has Danny Thompson playing the double bass on it. His name will come up many, many different times. John Cale comes in and drops a couple of sections. Originally, Joe had heard Nick's songs and realized that they were just too beautiful to leave unadorned. They needed some arrangements, some other instrumentation going on around them to make the songs a little fuller. So he gets on the phone with Peter Asher and says, "Hey, who have you got in mind?" Uh, they get together. At that time, you couldn't hear it until you had recorded it, and were listening to the playback. So Nick comes into the studio with these other musicians. They come out, they record these songs. They're listening to the playback, and I think Joe Boyd says that they were perfectly competent and absolutely stale. They just didn't really enrich anything. And about that time, Nick says, "Well, there was a guy back at Cambridge that arranged some of my stuff, and well, it wasn't too bad." And that turned out to be Robert Kirby, and he comes in and writes these beautiful arrangements, and it all comes together as a beautiful record. It didn't really sell peanuts, but everybody had high hopes for it, and they send Nick out on the road to promote the record. He makes it to the third show, calls Joe and says, "Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm coming back home." He just didn't want to play live in front of people. And back then, in order to sell a record, to get your name out there, you had to tour. So the next thing you know, we got several records, but that was it. And Nick Drake, we lost him early. He vanished into obscurity until Volkswagen decided to use Pink Moon in a 2000 Volkswagen ad. And the next thing you know, Nick Drake is rediscovered, sells more records 35 years after his death than he ever did in his lifetime. So in 1969, right after this came out, and they're celebrating the release of this, Joe Boyd gets a call to let him know that Fairport, on the way home from a show, has had a van accident on the M1, and Martin Lample, their drummer, was killed. And there you have it, an absolute tragedy. And so Fairport decided to continue on. For what I had forgotten to mention is that Joe Boyd, even though he couldn't get Sandy Denny in the band, decided that Judy Dybel needed a little help with vocals, and so for their second record, he had brought in Ian Matthews to give her, just a little, give the band a little bit fuller sound vocally. By the third record, Ian had left, Judy had gone, and now Sandy's in the band. And that would have been unhalf-bricking. So now that's come out. Then the van accident happens. They decide to carry on, but they decide that they're going to have a new drummer. They end up finding Dave Maddox, who is a ballroom jazz drummer, which ends up working out absolutely perfectly for the direction that they are going into, which is folk rock, English folk rock. They go back into the studio at that time. Sandy's writing songs. Richard Thompson's writing songs. Ashley Hutchings, the bass player, is doing song catching, going down to the Cecil Sharp library and going through those old songs and bringing songs back to the band. The next thing you know, what they come out with is considered to be Fairport's greatest record. This is Legion Leaf. And it is absolutely phenomenal. And it's one of my favorites. These records that we're talking about here, these are some of my favorite records. It's crazy. I was thinking about it. If I had to put, there's the kitty, there's the little Easy Bond. If I had to name my top 100 records, I think an easy dozen, 10 to 15 records would be produced by Joe Boyd. So, 5 Leaves Left, Legion Leaf, 1970 comes up. 1970, Joe Boyd produced 17 records. 17 records. That's, if you think about that, that's incredible. But just to go through them real quick in the book, Yashti Bunyan, Nick Drake, Fairport Convention with Full House, Now Be Thankful, Father and Gay, Incredible String Band 3 times, Chris McGregor, Brother of Death, John and Beverly Martin, Jeff and Maria Muldaur. 17 records in 1970. So the next one that we're going to talk about is going to be Father and Gay. So, we talked about briefly, I know I didn't talk about it long enough, we talked about Legion Leaf, and everyone thought this was a masterpiece, but again, well, everyone now thinks it's a masterpiece, and those locally that were closely associated with it knew it was back in the day, but it sold peanuts. After this record comes out, Sandy Denny decides that she wants to be in a band it's a little bit different, that's going to focus on the old English stuff, and she really wants to be kind of the only singer, and she leaves. Ashley Hutchings decides that he wants to do more traditional music, and he gets together with Matty Pryor and Martin Carthy, and they form Steel Eye Span. And so you would have thought that that would have been the end of Fairport, but it wasn't. They carried on in mighty, mighty, mighty form, and we'll talk more about that later. But Father and Gay. So Sandy Denny has hooked up with her new boyfriend Trevor Lucas, and they've formed this band, Father and Gay. Now, of course, there was on what we did on our holidays, there's the Fairport song, Father and Gay, about the castle where Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned before her demise. This is a wonderful record. At the time, Joe Boyd advised her against this. He thought that what they had done with Fairport was wonderful. Joe Boyd didn't really like Trevor Lucas a whole lot. Thought, anyway, we won't go down that rabbit hole, read the book, but what he wants to see and what the record company want to see, if Sandy's going to leave, go solo, and we'll give you a big advance for a Sandy Denny record, okay? She didn't want to do that. So Joe Boyd gets her a decent advance. They come out with Father and Gay. The next thing, they've gone out and bought a Bentley to cruise around London in, and a gigantic PA system nicknamed Stonehenge. And the next thing you know, they're done. And so this is pretty much all that we got of this lineup. But this is a wonderful record, and it's a great one to have in the collection. And once again, of course, all of these produced by Joe Boyd. Also in 1970, we've got Nico Desert Shore. So of all of these records that I'm going to talk about today, this one's probably my least lived in. It's got a wonderful sound. It's recorded wonderfully, but I never was a huge fan of Nico, never was a huge fan of her voice. I didn't love the stuff that she did with Velvet Underground, although I thought her voice was pretty well suited for that. It's pretty flat. This record, to me, these tracks come off less as songs more than and more like vocal exercises or choral exercises or that type of thing. But of course, John Cale is all over this. Joe and John had an association that went back all the way to those Nick Drake records. And it's an interesting record. It's just not one that I go to very, very often. But it's cool to put on, have in the background, and just kind of listen to. Also that year, so we saw on the cover of the book, we had Jeff Muldaur and Maria D'Amato. So they get married, Jeff and Maria Muldaur, and this is Pottery Pie. This came out in 1970, one of those 17 records that Joe produced in 1970. So that story's pretty long. We're not going to dive too deep into it. Jeff was an early roommate of Joe's, became a solo artist in his own right. The first time that Joe Boyd saw Maria D'Amato, she was backstage playing a fiddle with Doc Martin and Sleepy John Estes, and he was just smitten with her. You could tell that she was going to go somewhere, and Jeff steals her away and steals her into the Jim Queskin jug band. They come out with several records, but now they've left and they've gone solo. A lot of people kind of refer to Gene Clark and Carla Olson's record as being kind of like the first Americana couples record, which of course would morph into the stuff that David Rawlings and Gillian Welch, and later on Robert Plant and Alison Krauss, that type of stuff. I think this is it. This is a wonderful record. There's a cappella stuff, there's gospel stuff, there's ragtime stuff, there's singer-songwriter type stuff. They both have very attractive voices. And it's just a wonderful little down-home record. So Catch It, I'll Be Your Baby Tonight, New Orleans Hopscotch Blues, Trials, Troubles, Tribulations, but the beautiful Prairie Lullaby, and then it ends with the a cappella Guide Me, O Great Jehovah. But just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful record. And of course, both of these figures, Jeff Muldaur and Maria Muldaur, will play a huge role in Joe Boyd's life and vice versa. But 1970s, Pottery Pie, that's a wonderful record. Also in 1970, Stormbringer, John and Beverly Martin. This is my favorite of the John and Beverly Martin records. This is Road to Ruin. This is a fantastic record. So Chris Blackwell of Island Records, him and Joe Boyd were good friends, and they would kind of trade distribution rights for different artists back and forth. Through that association, John Martin became part of the Joe Boyd fold. At the time, John and Beverly Martin came as a married couple package, and I love their music, and I thought Beverly Martin brought a lot. She's got a great voice. She's got a solid voice, and I think on songs like Anti-Aviator, Primrose Hill, I love those songs. But I also love John Martin. I like his playing style, his guitar style. This album has got all of those usual cast of characters: Danny Thompson, Dave Pegg, who would take Ashley Hutchings' place in Fairport Convention, ended up playing in Jethro Tull and his touring band and recording band for years. But this is a wonderful record. The musicianship is great. There's sax, there's flute, there's great drums, great piano. The harmony is great. The singing is great. But the record, they really... Island, Chris Blackwell, they really wanted more of John Martin as a solo artist. And unfortunately, John and Beverly ended up divorcing, and John Martin put out some wonderful records for Island Records. But this is a wonderful record, Road to Ruin, and if you haven't heard this, check this out. So that was 1971. 1973 was a huge year for Joe Boyd. Maria Muldaur comes out with this solo record, and it has the smash hit Midnight at the Oasis, #1 for many, 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 many weeks. But this album is so much more than that. And if you look at who's on it, you've got Richard Green, and we'll talk about him more in a moment, but the violinist, played in Bill Monroe's band. You've got Bill Keith. Also, you've got Dr. John. You've got Jim Keltner, Chris Etheridge. You've got the wonderful Clarence Wright, the wonderful Clarence White, the wonderful Ry Cooder, the brilliant David Grisman, and Amos Garrett guitar. This is a wonderful record, and it was a huge hit. And really, Midnight at the Oasis is kind of like the one-off track. It's not really like the rest of the record, but it's very organic, wonderfully recorded, obviously. And if you haven't heard that, that's a great record as well. Also that year, Joe Boyd had been put in charge of Warner Brothers film music. One of the main reasons for that was that he was the only person that had film footage of Jimi Hendrix playing an acoustic guitar. And we've all heard that, Hear My Train A-Comin'. And so he was influential in the music for that soundtrack, that film, Jimi Hendrix. But also Dueling Banjos. And he gets together and produces this for Eric Weisberg and Steve Mandel. We all know Dueling Banjos, but the sound of this is fantastic. And this turned a lot of hippies and rockers onto string music, bluegrass music, just the power of this music. And this is still a wonderful record. And, you know, between these two right here, and these both came out in 73, so between those two records, we've got a nice amount of success, and the ball is rolling. Hannibal Records is formed. Witch Season Productions had already been formed. I skipped over that part of the story, and we're up and rolling. So 1974, and I haven't been able to find out a whole lot about how Joe Boyd became associated with this record, but you guys may or may not know the story behind Mule Skinner. Mule Skinner is kind of like a bluegrass, well, it is a bluegrass supergroup. You've got the aforementioned Richard Green. Him and Peter Rowan had both played with Bill Monroe and had also both been in C Train together. You've got Clarence White, the brilliant Clarence White, and all of his wonderful work on those Byrds records. But the Kentucky Colonels and Nashville West. You've got Bill Keith. I mean, whose records has he not played on? And then, of course, David Grisman from Earth Opera. This is a bluegrass lover's absolute dream. And again, I'm not sure how Joe Boyd became associated with it, but basically, Bill Monroe reached out to Peter Rowan to put together a group of young bluegrass guys that would do a show with Bill Monroe's current band, a televised program. So you've got the young and the old. And on the way to tape the show, Bill Monroe's bus broke down. And Mule Skinner ended up showing up, and they did the show, and it was such a success and such a hit that they said, hey, let's put out an album of the show, and let's also put out another album. This is the second cover of this. This is a reissue. But this is wonderful, and it's got, you know, you've got Mule Skinner Blues, Blue and Lonesome, Footprints in the Snow, White House Blues, Opus 57, David Grisman's wonderful piece, Runaways of the Moon, Rain and Snow, Blue Mule. So this is a wonderful record, and again, produced by Richard Green and Joe Boyd. I'd love to find out a little bit more about how they got together on that. That's the one thing I can't find Joe talking about. In 1975, and boy, it was hard to, you know, I only picked one record from each of these artists. Joe Boyd produced all the incredible string band stuff, most of the Fairport stuff, most of the Nick Drake stuff. You know, I only picked one, and it was really hard to do, especially with these guys. Kate and AnnaMcClargle. I love them. I love their sound. I love their music. I love their voices together. I love their songwriting. This came out in 1975. And, you know, just to give you an idea, Tony Levin plays bass on it. Steve Gadd plays drums on it. The musicianship on here is just incredible. And the songwriting, Kiss and Say Goodbye, My Town, Heart Like a Wheel, which of course Linda Ronstadt would have a huge hit with. But Tell My Sister, the swimming song, which is absolutely beautiful. Jigsaw Puzzle of Life, Traveling On for Jesus. But Kate and AnnaMcClargle, you know, Kate would end up marrying Loudon Wainwright, and together they would have Rufus Wainwright and Martha Wainwright. And I love all of those artists. Just what a wonderful story. Musically, at least, anyway. But I love all of their records. I love Dancer with Bruised Knees, but this is the one that I probably go to more and more often. This is Kate and AnnaMcClargle, self-titled, produced by Joe Boyd, 1975. In 1976, Joe produced Toots and the Maytals, and that's absolutely worth seeking out. 77 was Dancer with Bruised Knees. 1982, so this is Richard and Linda Thompson. So, and we all know the story behind this record. married couple, but you can tell from the layout of the record, Richard down here in the corner and Linda's up here just in a pretty simple picture, not a very good one, just hanging on the wall, bare light bulb. This is a breakup record of all breakup records, but it is absolutely wonderful. And the playing on it. I mean, Richard Thompson, if you don't know Richard Thompson, going all the way back to Joe, seeing him and hearing him play as a 17-year-old kid, break into a James Burton lick that just absolutely melted him. Richard Thompson's one of those guitar players that can just take a song and elevate it to the next level. Just like Clarence White of the Byrds, who absolutely rescued those later Byrds records, but that's a different story. This came out as they're breaking out, and of course it's on the Hannibal label, and my original was pretty beat up, so this is a reissue, but it sounds fantastic. And this band, so you've got Richard and Linda, you've also got Simon Nicol from back in the Fairport days, you've got Dave Pegg again, who had taken Ashley Hutchings' place in Fairport. You've got Pete Zorn, and of course you've got Dave Maddox also from Fairport. But this album is fantastic. It's kind of all over the place. It's not, if you put it on expecting Fairport, it's going to surprise you quite a bit. But the songs just kind of seep into you, and it's recorded absolutely, absolutely beautiful. So that was 1982. In 1984, REM was ready to make a new record. And the Athens, Georgia band had put out 2 records that had done pretty well, but they weren't real happy with the sound of them. Peter Buck, the record collector, music aficionado, he had all of these records. He had the Fairport records. He had the Incredible String Band records. He had the Nick Drake records, and he knew Joe Boyd, the sound that he could get. So he contacts him, asks him if he can fly over to Athens, Georgia, and hang out and talk to them about possibly producing his their third record. So Joe comes over, he hears them play a few songs, he plays them a few things that he's working on at the time. They decide, yeah, we'd like for you to produce our record. And so he tells them, well, listen, guys, I'm going to need you to come over to London to record it. I've got a record label to run. You know, Joe Boyd was deep in Hannibal Records at the time. And so not too happy about traveling, okay? Especially Michael Stipe. They didn't want to go to London to record a record, but they decided to bite the bullet and go on over. They get there, and as it turns out, and Joe will tell you in the book, but you know, they get there, and Michael Stipe ends up having a wonderful time. He wakes up early, he'll go to museums and stuff like that, and then come into the studio refreshed and ready to go. Whereas the other guys got a hotel outside of town. They'd have to wake up, get on the train, they'd be half asleep by the time they got there, come into the studio kind of groggy, and So this is one of those that Joe looks back at and thinks, yeah, we might have been able to do a little bit better. There are people that like the sound of this record. There are people that don't like the sound of this record. I love it. It's just got a weird kind of a particular sound to me. And, you know, you drop the needle on this, and this is that brown label IRS, but feeling gravity's pull. I love it. I think it's recorded really well. And of course, this also has my personal favorite REM song, Driver 8. I just love that song. But this is a great record. It's recorded really, really well. I know I've said that probably I've probably said that 14 times now, right? Because this is the 13th record that we've talked about. But Fables of Reconstruction, 1984, REM. So Joe Boyd would go on to produce a lot of other stuff. He would work with Danny Thompson, Billy Bragg, Tamani Diabate, 10,000 Maniacs, Robin Hitchcock. Pardon me. He would produce an absolutely wonderful record of Cuban jazz called Cubanismo. And him and his wife are, up until I think in maybe 2021, 2022, still releasing records. Right now they're working on projects in the Balkans, recording traditional local music there. But Joe Boyd, these are some of my favorite records of all time, and they're all produced by Joe Boyd. So check out some Joe Boyd stuff, okay? Pick up this book, take a deep dive. I'm interested in hearing, go through your collection now that you know who Joe Boyd is, or now that I've given you kind of a refresher or whatever. Go through. I think you'd be surprised at how many different records that you have that were produced by Joe Boyd. But most importantly, put them on and listen to some good music and enjoy and have a good time. Hey, I appreciate you hanging out. Listen, if you like this content, like the video, like the channel, do me a favor and subscribe and hit that bell for the notifications, and we'll try to get more content posted. In the meantime, I appreciate you hanging out, and we'll see you next time. Take it easy.